They say awakening feels like coming home, like a burst of light after years in the dark. But for many, it begins as something else entirely. Not light, not peace, but silence. A silence so deep it swallows everything. Your dreams, your ambitions, even your sense of self. And in that silence, a strange question begins to echo. If I've finally seen the truth, why do I feel so empty? Because somewhere along your journey of awakening, maybe after a piercing moment of insight, or the quiet aftermath of a personal collapse, something shifted. The world, once so solid, began to shimmer like a mirage. Part 1. The fall into stillness. You saw through the noise, the games, the endless chase for meaning, and for a fleeting moment, there was silence. At first, it felt like liberation, like your soul had finally broken free from the machinery of illusion. You felt weightless, radiant, as if the truth itself had reached out and touched you. But then, something strange began to happen. Not all at once, not with thunder or lightning. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, the light began to dim. The meaning you once clung to began to dissolve. Not because life grew worse, but because it grew transparent. The old motivations, success, validation, belonging, no longer pulled you. You stopped chasing. You stopped striving. Not in rebellion, but in resignation. It was like your soul turned the volume of life all the way down and forgot how to turn it back up again. And then came the whisper, soft at first, then relentless. Why do I feel so numb now that I finally see the truth? You expected awakening to ignite your passion, not extinguish it. To fill you with meaning, not strip it away. But for many, especially the seekers, the sensitives, the deeply introspective souls, awakening doesn't set fire to life. It empties it. I remember a friend, deeply spiritual, luminous, sincere. She devoured every sacred text, listened to Tolly Watt's Krishnamurti. She walked through her dark night of the soul and emerged radiant, saying she had finally seen it. The illusion of identity, the futility of ego, the endless trap of chasing external validation. But 2 months later, she called me, her voice barely above a whisper. I used to cry over not achieving enough. Now I don't care if I achieve anything at all. I thought awakening would light me up, not leave me like this. Carl Jung, long before modern spirituality dressed it in new language, understood this post-awakening fog. He didn't call it enlightenment or ascension. He called it the confrontation with the unconscious. And he warned us, enlightenment does not come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. It sounds beautiful until you realize what it means. Awakening isn't a destination. It's a death. The death of everything false within you. The death of the stories that gave you meaning. The collapse of the identity that gave you direction. Careers, relationships, ambitions. The scaffolding of your old life begins to crumble. But here's the paradox Jung would point out. Your ego doesn't die. It just loses its map. And without that map, motivation disappears. You're not lazy. You're not broken. You're in between. You've woken up from something, but haven't yet woken up into something else. This is the threshold most people misinterpret. The sacred confusion between who you were and who you're becoming. And in that quiet, unbearable stillness, your soul begins to whisper, stay. Because what feels like meaninglessness is not failure. It's the first step into the sacred void. A place Jung saw as essential for individuation. The process of becoming your true, undivided self. But our modern world avoids this phase at all costs. We rush, we fix, we hustle. We treat stillness as stagnation, and numbness as something to escape. Yet Jung would tell you, this stillness, this holy disorientation, is where the real transformation begins. Part 2, the Jungian descent. When you first awaken, it feels as if the veil has been torn away. But what no one tells you is that once the veil falls, there's nothing left to hide behind. The truth is raw, unfiltered, and it begins to undo you, piece by piece. Carl Jung understood this descent better than most. He saw it not as madness, but as initiation. The beginning of a deeper, darker conversation between the conscious self and the soul. He warned that awakening is not the end of suffering. It's the beginning of seeing it clearly for the first time. The illusions that once comforted you, the roles, the ambitions, the masks, start to rot in your hands. And without them, you stand naked before yourself. This is what Jung called the psychological death. The collapse of the structures that once held your identity in place. The ego doesn't vanish, it begins to unravel. Its carefully drawn lines blur and dissolve. You start asking questions that shake the foundations of your life. Who am I without my work? Who am I without someone to love me? Who am I without something to prove? And the silence that follows these questions is deafening. It's in this silence that the shadow begins to stir. The parts of you that were exiled, the anger, the fear, the desire, the grief, start to rise from the depths. They've been waiting all this time for the moment when your consciousness was finally still enough to hear them. Jung believed that this confrontation with the shadow is unavoidable. If you do not face it consciously, it appears as fate, as crisis, chaos, or the slow erosion of your will. He said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that darkness is not something outside of you. It's the unlived life within you, the emotions you suppress to survive, the truths you buried to belong. So when you feel numb after awakening, it isn't because you've lost your soul, it's because you've stopped pretending. You've stopped lying to yourself about what matters. And without the noise of old ambitions, you can finally hear what your psyche has been whispering all along. That everything you used to chase was a substitute for something much older. A hunger not for success, but for wholeness. But the path to wholeness passes through the underworld. You can't transcend what you haven't yet met. So your psyche begins its descent, pulling you downward into the layers of forgotten pain and buried memory. It's not punishment, it's purification. The ego resists, of course. It panics, clings, bargains, tries to rebuild the old life. But every attempt to return to normal feels hollow, like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit. You may feel as though your energy has vanished, your creativity dried up, your purpose stolen. But this is the soul's strategy. It's dismantling the engine that kept you running in circles. Because to become whole, you must first become empty. This is where most people stop. In the fog, the fatigue, the confusion, and call it failure. But Jung saw something sacred in that fog. He said that the unconscious rises when the conscious mind no longer knows what to do. And in that surrender, a deeper intelligence begins to move. So if you find yourself staring at the ceiling, unable to care about what once thrilled you, know that something in you is quietly reordering itself. You are not lazy. You are in metamorphosis. The ego calls it collapse. The soul calls it alchemy. This is the crucible of awakening, where the old self dies not in flames, but in silence. And though you can't see it yet, beneath that silence, the soil is stirring. A new kind of life is beginning to take root, one that doesn't bloom in the light of ambition, but in the dark, rich compost of everything you've let go of. Part 3, the sacred pause. After the collapse comes an unbearable stillness. Days blur together. The fire that once drove you flickers, then fades. You're not broken, but you can no longer burn for what once mattered. You wake in the morning and feel the weight of existence pressing down. The world moves on, people chase goals, laugh, build, destroy, while you stand at the edge of it all, watching through a fog that won't lift. This is the sacred pause, the still, in-between space where everything has fallen apart and nothing new has yet begun. Feels like death, but it's actually gestation. Carl Jung called this the enantiodromia, the great reversal. When one force in the psyche reaches its extreme, it turns into its opposite. When the outer fire burns out, the inner light begins to kindle. You are being pulled inward, not by failure, but by necessity. The psyche can't sustain a life built only on the surface, so it forces you into depth. This is where you learn that awakening isn't about ascension. It's about descent and integration. You are being rewired, reformed, taught to live not from ambition, but from alignment. The sacred pause is the psyche's way of saying, stop, don't move, listen. But most of us fight it. We call it depression, stagnation, burnout. And yes, it can feel like all of those things. But beneath the ache is something profoundly intelligent, something ancient. You are being stripped of false motion. Every part of you that sought validation or survival through doing is now being dismantled, because the next chapter of your life cannot be built from striving, only from stillness. It's like the caterpillar dissolving in the cocoon. From the outside, it looks like decay. Inside, a miracle is taking place. The old form liquefies, so something winged can emerge. And this stage cannot be rushed. The modern world despises stillness. It equates silence with failure. But in Jungian psychology, stillness is sacred. It is the midpoint of transformation, the place where the unconscious begins to speak. You may start to dream more vividly now. You might feel drawn to solitude, to nature, to art that mirrors your inner weather. Follow those impulses. They are not distractions, they are directions. Jung said that when the conscious ego is quiet, the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, begins to guide the process. It shows you, piece by piece, what must die and what must be reborn. But the self speaks in symbols, not sentences. It doesn't say, here's your new purpose. It shows you an image, a feeling, a subtle pull. And your task is to stay long enough in the stillness, to understand its language. That's why this phase is so fragile. Many turn back here, terrified by the silence, desperate to feel normal again. But if you can resist the urge to run, something extraordinary begins to happen. Your nervous system, once addicted to constant doing, starts to rest in being. Your energy, once scattered in every direction, begins to consolidate. And slowly, a quiet confidence returns. Not the confidence of control, but of connection. You start to notice subtle beauty again. Light on the wall, wind in the trees, the pulse of life underneath everything. The ordinary becomes sacred, because you are no longer looking through the eyes of the ego. You are seeing through the eyes of the soul. This is the pause before the dawn. The soul is preparing you for rebirth, but it will not happen until you've learned to trust the silence that once terrified you, because the moment you stop trying to escape it, transforms. The stillness becomes not an absence, but a presence, a vast, living intelligence that was always there, waiting for you to listen. And from that silence, the first whisper of your new life begins to rise. Part 4, the rebirth of meaning. There comes a quiet morning when something shifts, not dramatically, not with fanfare or light, but with a single breath that feels different, fuller, truer, as if life itself has exhaled through you. You don't even notice it at first. You pour your tea, open a window, and for a moment, just one, the world feels gentle again. The colors return, the air hums softly, and you realize that the silence which once felt like a tomb has become a womb. Something within you has taken root, something wordless, ancient, and patient. This is the beginning of rebirth, not into who you were, but into who you truly are. Jung called this the emergence of the self, the deeper center of your being that holds all opposites in balance. It's not interested in perfection or performance. It's interested in wholeness. The ego strives for success. The self seeks integration. And integration always begins in humility, the recognition that you are not just the light, but also the shadow that dances behind it. You no longer chase meaning, you begin to live it. The small, sacred gestures of daily life, making food, tending a plant, walking in the evening air, start to feel like rituals, because you are no longer doing them to get somewhere. You are doing them as life itself. And in this simplicity, you discover something the world never taught you. Peace is not found in the absence of pain, but in the presence of alignment. You begin to see that everything that broke you was not a detour but initiation. Every collapse was a clearing, every silence a seedbed. The numbness that once felt like death was simply the soil softening for growth. Now, meaning doesn't come from grand ideals. It arises from contact with your body, your breath, your truth, and the quiet pulse of something larger than you. You no longer need to prove, because you have become. Jung wrote that the process of individuation, the lifelong unfolding of the self, is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming real. And the real is rarely comfortable. It's messy, paradoxical, alive. But it is yours, woven from both your wounds and your wonders. You start to see others differently too. You recognize their pain as mirrors of your own. Compassion replaces judgment. You no longer need to fix anyone, because you've learned that true healing cannot be forced, only lived. There's a gravity in your presence now, a stillness that draws without demanding. People feel it, the quiet power of someone who has faced their own depths and returned with gentleness instead of armor. This is what awakening truly means. Not to escape the human experience, but to inhabit it fully, to hold both the ache and the awe, the shadow and the sun, in the same open heart. And one day you look back at the pain, the numbness, the long nights of silence, and realized they were not empty after all. They were sacred chambers, where life was remaking you in secret. The seed that died in darkness has split open and reached toward the light. You've not become someone new, you've become someone whole. And from that wholeness, a new kind of meaning begins to radiate outward, not as a mission, but as a presence. You don't chase purpose anymore, you embody it. Every breath, every act, every pause is infused with a quiet knowing that the silence you once feared was never emptiness. It was the sound of your soul, waiting for you to listen. Part 5. The Return to the World. The journey does not end in silence. It begins there, when the soul has been tempered by darkness, and the old self has fallen away like ash. You do not rise as who you once were. You rise as something quieter, deeper, more rooted in truth. This is the return, not to the world as you left it, but to the same world seen through new eyes. You walk through the same streets, meet the same people, face the same chaos, and yet something is profoundly different. The noise no longer penetrates you. The opinions that once shaped your every move now pass through you like wind through leaves. You are no longer performing. You are present. Jung called this the integration of the self into life, when inner transformation ripples outward, and reality itself begins to respond. You start to live not from reaction, but from resonance. You no longer seek to control outcomes. You attune to them. The universe becomes less of a battlefield and more of a conversation. You stop searching for signs, because you become one. There's a groundedness in your being now, not the brittle confidence of certainty, but the supple strength of surrender. You understand that chaos and order are not enemies but dance partners. You can stand in the storm and not be swept away, because you no longer resist its rhythm. You've learned that meaning is not found by escaping life, but by embracing it, completely, courageously, consciously. You speak less now, but every word carries weight. You act less impulsively, but every action hums with intention. Your presence itself becomes medicine, a quiet reminder that peace is not passive, it's power refined by stillness. The people around you may not understand what changed. They may say you've grown distant, calmer, harder to read. But what really happened is this: you stopped needing to be understood. You realize that your path is not meant to be explained. It's meant to be embodied. And so you move through the world differently now. Less urgency, more grace, less noise, more knowing. You find beauty in imperfection, rhythm in uncertainty, and love not as possession, but as presence. This is what Jung called the individuated life, a life lived in alignment with the self. It's not glamorous. It's not the kind of enlightenment that glows or preaches. It's quiet, human, tender, the sacred expressed through the ordinary. You may still feel lost sometimes. You may still stumble, still ache, still doubt. But now you understand that even in the lostness, the soul is guiding you. That wholeness was never about never falling again, but about knowing how to return. So you live fully. You work, you love, you grieve, you create, not to escape pain, but to participate in the great unfolding of life. And in that participation, every breath becomes prayer. Every act becomes art. Every silence a doorway. Because you now know, awakening was never about leaving the world behind. It was about returning to it, with your eyes finally open. And perhaps one night, you'll sit under a quiet sky and realize the same stars that once looked distant and cold now pulse with a strange intimacy, because they're no longer out there. They're mirrored within you. The journey inward and the journey outward were never two different paths. They were the same spiral, turning toward the same truth, that you and the world are not separate, that consciousness and creation are one vast breathing whole. And in that realization, you finally understand what awakening really was. It was never about becoming more. It was about becoming real. In the end, awakening was never about rising above life. It was about falling deeply into it. The fire that once burned out was never lost. It simply learned to glow quieter, steadier from within. You've walked through darkness not to escape it, but to understand its light. Jung was right. Enlightenment isn't the absence of shadow, but the harmony between both. So if you find yourself drifting in the in-between, don't rush. The stillness you fear is sacred. It's where the self dissolves and the soul begins to breathe again.